He was slumped against the saloon wall, eyes clouded, boots torn, beard tangled like old rope. Folks passed by like he was part of the dust, but when a young cowboy offered him a cup of water and a moment of kindness, he unknowingly kicked a hornet's nest of power, secrets, and legacy. Because that wasn't just any old drifter. That was the governor's father. And the cowboy? He was about to find out that mercy on the frontier sometimes carries a reward, and sometimes a reckoning. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The sun glared down on Sagebrush Ridge like the eye of some cruel god, and the wind swept the main street in sluggish swirls, carrying grit, scraps of paper, and the stench of stale whiskey. Against the warped, splintered wall of the Sand Spur Saloon, a man who looked more like a pile of rags than a living soul sagged with his knees drawn to his chest. Boots split at the toes, beard matted with dirt and old blood. His mouth moved, but no one listened, not even the dogs, who sniffed and moved on. His eyes flickered beneath heavy lids, clouded not just by age, but by memories no one had asked about in years. Children darted past, hooting, one hurling a rock that clipped the man's shoulder. He groaned and shifted but didn't raise a hand to shield himself. A woman in a bonnet crossed to the other side of the street, murmuring, disgraceful under her breath, clutching her basket tighter. A pair of gamblers lounging outside the saloon laughed, one spitting near the old man's feet. Should have died with the war, the other said. But the man didn't flinch. He wasn't truly there, not all the way. He smelled like loss, like someone left too long under an unkind Sunday, and yet, amid the bustle of market carts, boots on planks, and piano chords leaking from cracked saloon shutters, one rider slowed. Jesse Coltrane was barely a man by most reckonings, 20, maybe 21, his shirt patched at the elbows, a dusty kerchief tied around his throat. He reined in his paint horse, dismounted, and squinted. Others walked around him, annoyed. "Let the fool rot," someone muttered. But Jesse stood still, hand on his belt buckle, the other shading his brow. He approached slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded dog, careful not to spook it. The man stank of sweat, vomit, and something deeper, like old leather left to mold in a forgotten barn. Jesse didn't recoil. He crouched beside him, pulled a dented tin flask from his saddlebag, unscrewed it, and offered it to the old man's cracked lips. At first there was nothing, then a flicker. The man sipped, then gulped, then choked, coughing hard enough to bring up bile. Jesse waited, squatting in the dust as the town watched, silent and disapproving. "Why you wasting good water on that?" a voice called from the saloon steps. Jesse didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a strip of jerky, and pressed it into the man's gnarled hand. The fingers trembled. The man looked at Jesse, really looked, for maybe the first time that day. His eyes were pale blue, one clouded over with cataract. They shimmered, and for a moment he looked almost young, something broken shining through the grime. "Thank you," he croaked, voice a rasp like gravel under boot. Jesse nodded, saying nothing. He stood, reached down, and hoisted the man gently to his feet. The crowd murmured, shifted, but no one moved to help. Jesse slung the man's arm over his shoulder, his own legs straining under the weight, and began walking toward the livery stable, one slow step at a time. Behind them, the saloon piano kept playing, out of tune and oblivious. The old man muttered nonsense again, head slumping to Jesse's shoulder. But this time, someone was listening. And somewhere, far beyond the hills of Sagebrush Ridge, that small kindness had already stirred a chain of consequences neither man could yet imagine. Jesse Coltrane guided the old man gently into the cool shadow of the stable loft behind the blacksmith's barn, careful not to rush him, careful not to listen to the murmured protests rising from the saloon porch or the sideways glances from the church steps across the street. Flies buzzed lazily in the heat as Jesse laid the man down on a pile of hay, propped his head with a rolled-up blanket he'd once used on cold trail nights, and uncorked his canteen again. The old man drank with shaking hands, every swallow looking like it hurt more than it helped. Jesse watched in silence, jaw tight, sweat sliding down his temple. He didn't know who this man was, or why it felt like gravity itself had shifted the moment he stopped for him, but something in Jesse's gut said this wasn't just pity. The town didn't care for that kind of pause. Charity don't grow corn. His boss had barked more than once, and Jesse could feel the weight of those eyes now judging, condemning, whispering. He handed the man the rest of his jerky strip, what little meat he had left till next pay. And when the old man chewed slow and wept without wiping his face, Jesse looked away out of respect. "Ain't nobody stopped for me in years," the man said finally, voice so hoarse it was barely more than a breath. Jesse offered no reply. He just sat beside him, his back against a hay bale, boots stretched out, one heel worn so thin the leather peeled like bark, his hat tilted low, shadowing his face from the slats of light breaking through the loft boards. Down below, someone spat and slammed a door. The world went on, indifferent. Jesse's horse neighed quietly outside, restless but patient like its rider. The old man coughed, dry and hard, and Jesse passed him a tin cup with creek water he'd filled earlier. "What's your name?" Jesse asked finally, voice quiet as twilight. The old man blinked, took a shaky breath, and said, "Don't matter anymore." Then, after a pause, softer, "Used to be Franklin Rhodes." Jesse furrowed his brow, the name bouncing around his memory like a moth in a jar, no clear meaning yet. The old man slumped back, exhaustion pulling at him like wet wool. Jesse stood, dusted off his pants, and covered the man with a spare horse blanket. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "I'll bring you something warm in the morning." He turned to go, but the old man reached out, fingers clutching weakly at Jesse's arm. "You're a good one," he said, voice breaking. Jesse looked down, eyes sharp but tired, nodding once. "Reckon we all need help sometime," he said. As he stepped out into the fading light, the sound of a harmonica drifted from the saloon, lonely and low, and the scent of roasting beans wafted on the wind. Jesse didn't know it yet, but the name Franklin Rhodes would soon stir ashes long buried in Sagebrush Ridge, and the quiet mercy he'd offered in that loft would light a match in a powder keg that stretched all the way to the halls of power. But for now, he simply walked down the empty path to his bunkhouse, back straight, hands calloused, heart unsettled in a way he couldn't yet name. The night air in Sagebrush Ridge was thick with smoke from hearth fires and the distant scent of creosote drifting down from the hills, but inside the stable loft, the world felt small, just hay, shadows, and the soft clink of a tin bowl against wood as Jesse handed the old man his supper. Steam curled up from the stew like a ghost, and the man, wrapped now in a patched wool blanket and looking more human than he had earlier, lifted the spoon with effort, his hands steadier but still trembling. Jesse sat across from him, boots stretched out, arms folded, hat tipped back just enough to show tired eyes. He didn't press for answers, didn't fill the silence with questions. He simply watched and waited. The lantern between them hissed faintly, casting long, flickering silhouettes across the wooden beams. Somewhere below, horses shifted in their stalls, hooves thudding softly against packed dirt. The old man cleared his throat after a long pause, looked Jesse dead in the eye, and said, almost like a confession, "Rhodes. Franklin Rhodes." Jesse blinked, the name catching like a burr on his thoughts. But he gave only a slow nod, like the name was just another in a long list of men the world had forgotten. "You from around here, Mr. Rhodes?" he asked casually, tearing a chunk of bread and handing it over. The old man laughed, a bitter, breathy thing. "Used to be. Long time back. Before they paved the roads with lies." Jesse tilted his head but said nothing more. Below them, unknown to either man, the barkeep, a wiry old-timer named Tulliver, was stacking crates behind the saloon's back wall, just beneath the loft's open window. He froze mid-motion, his ears pricking like a coyote catching wind of a predator. Franklin Rhodes. The name hit him like a slap. He set the crate down slowly, heart thudding hard in his chest. That name hadn't been spoken in over a decade, not since the newspapers printed that Rhodes had vanished somewhere east of Dry Gulch, presumed dead after a failed attempt to blow the whistle on political land fraud. And now, here it was muttered by a half-dead drifter resting in Coltrane's hayloft. Tulliver didn't move for a long moment, eyes darting toward the saloon's back door, mind racing through old headlines, past dealings, and a certain visit the governor himself had once made to Sagebrush Ridge. Years ago, with pale lips and shifty eyes, up in the loft, Franklin had fallen into silence again, spoon resting in his empty bowl. Jesse took the tin and packed it away without a word, dousing the lantern slowly, careful not to wake the other man fully. "Get some sleep," he murmured, standing and stretching. Franklin's voice drifted from the dark, quiet and thick with something heavy. "They'll come looking, Jesse. Once they know." Jesse froze, spine stiffening. "Who?" he asked. But the old man didn't reply, just let out a breath and rolled onto his side, back to the room. Jesse left the loft and stepped into the moonlit yard, saddle creaking as he leaned against the rail fence. Across the way, Tulliver was already slipping into the saloon, hands shaking as he reached for the telegraph key tucked under the bar. His fingers hovered, then began to tap. A message sent into the darkness. Just 4 words. "Franklin Rhodes is alive." And miles away, wherever power sat fat and comfortable behind polished desks, something ancient stirred and its eyes opened. By sunrise, Sagebrush Ridge was humming with tension, not loud and riotous, but quiet, the kind that stiffens spines and dries mouths, the kind that moves like smoke beneath doors and behind eyes. Jesse Coltrane walked down Main Street with his head level and his gait steady, but every step felt like it echoed too loud. Folks who had once nodded silent greetings now avoided his gaze, and those who dared look did so with squinting suspicion. The morning air was still cool, but sweat clung to Jesse's back as he entered the stable to check on Franklin. The old man was awake, sipping water, face pale but clearer than it had been. They shared no words, just a glance, and then Jesse stepped out again, where Sheriff Dobbs waited at the edge of the alley, thumbs hooked into the belt of his dust-colored coat, lips pursed around a half-chewed toothpick. "Coltrane," he said flatly, eyes unreadable beneath his hat brim. "What in hell you think you're doing keeping a man like that under roof?" Jesse stared at him, unmoving. "Man's half dead. Ain't a crime to help someone breathe." The sheriff narrowed his gaze. "Ain't just someone. That's a name that carries ruin, son. We don't need ruin round here." Jesse didn't blink. "Ain't running a tribunal, Sheriff. Just gave him a blanket." Dobbs stepped closer, voice low and sharp as a knife's edge. "He's got enemies. Real ones. You draw him in, and it won't be just your neck gets squeezed. This town don't belong to him. It belongs to quiet." Jesse let that hang, said nothing, and turned away. By mid-morning, the preacher caught him outside the feed store, robes fluttering in the breeze, eyes wild with desperate wisdom. "You're poking fires you don't see the shape of, Jesse," he hissed, gripping the young man's arm. "That man's got devils on his heels. Ain't righteous to shoulder the sins of another man's war." Jesse gently pulled free, replied only, "Wasn't about righteousness." The preacher stared at him as though that answer was more dangerous than blasphemy. At noon, Jesse arrived at the Ridgehorn Ranch to muck stalls, only to find his boss, Cyrus Morrow, waiting by the gate, arms folded, a cigar hanging from his mouth like a threat. "Heard you're playing nursemaid to that Rhodes fella," he grunted. Jesse met his gaze, wiping sweat from his brow. "Don't reckon that's your concern." Morrow barked a short, humorless laugh. "Boy, everything's my concern when it threatens my land, my herd, or my damn payroll. You keep bringing politics into Sagebrush, you can ride your sorry hide out of town. I don't pay men to stir up ghosts." Jesse stared at the dust for a long moment, then looked up and said quietly, "Didn't do it for pay." Morrow's eyes narrowed to slits. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and stomped off, leaving Jesse with the scent of cigar smoke and something heavier certainty. That night, back in the stable, Jesse sat beside Franklin in the loft, silence stretching long and taut. The old man said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward Jesse with something between apology and fear. Outside, the wind shifted. The church bell didn't ring. The saloon piano went quiet. All across Sagebrush Ridge, doors were bolted early, lamps dimmed low, and neighbors spoke in whispers behind curtains. The name Rhodes had been spoken into the soil, and now it was growing, slow and dark, like a storm that hadn't yet shown its teeth but was already licking the horizon with thunder. The days that followed bled together in a haze of heat, suspicion, and slow recovery. And while the town of Sagebrush Ridge watched from behind shuttered windows and pursed lips, up in the hay-sweet loft of the stable, Franklin Rhodes slowly began to return to himself, not fully, not cleanly, but in fits and fragments. like someone stumbling through smoke with only broken lantern light to guide them. His voice grew steadier, though still brittle, and his eyes, blue and sharp beneath the haze of age, began to hold Jesse's longer when they spoke. He talked often in circles, memories half lost or tangled with fever, but Jesse, patient as worn stone, listened without judgment. The stories came slow at first, half sentences, stammered names, cryptic phrases like, "They moved the boundary lines," "Took the water rights right out from under us," or "The papers lied," and the preachers knew. Jesse tried to make sense of it, but it was like trying to catch wind with bare hands. Franklin would drift in and out, one moment lucid, the next lost in mutterings about courtrooms and railroads, about a son who sold his father for a handshake and a title. Then, one morning as the sun filtered soft and gold through the loft slats, Franklin sat up straight, eyes burning clear for the first time in days. "He wasn't always like that, you know," he said suddenly. "My boy, Elias, he used to believe. We were going to fight the land barons, expose the frauds, tear the poison out by the roots. But power," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Power don't share a saddle, son. It makes its own trail and leaves its blood behind." Jesse sat cross-legged nearby, chewing a stalk of hay, face unreadable. Franklin turned to him then, squinting hard. "You ever hear of the Flint Ridge Accord?" Jesse shook his head. "They called it a land grant. Said it was legal. Said the state was reclaiming unoccupied territory. But we knew it was theft. That land belonged to the Navajo, the ranchers, the widows. Your daddy Henry Coltrane, he rode with me, helped me organize the riders who stood against it." Jesse's heart thumped hard against his ribs. The name hadn't passed Franklin's lips until now. Not since that first night. He leaned in, eyes narrowed. "My father?" Franklin nodded slowly. "A quiet man, but he had fire in him. Righteous kind. We rode together through dust and flame. We spoke in tents by lantern light. We held the line till they sent the marshals. I was arrested. He vanished. I thought him dead." Jesse sat back, stunned. His father had been a ranch hand, nothing more. At least that's what his mother used to say before she died, coughing into a rag. "Why you tellin' me this?" he asked, voice tight. Franklin looked away, voice low. "Because they didn't just break us, they erased us, made ghosts of the truth. But your face, I see Henry in your jaw, in your stubborn silence. And I reckon you got the same choice comin', whether you know it or not." Outside, church bells tolled once, then fell silent. Jesse stared at the hay-strewn floor, the story spinning in his gut like a slow fire catching dry timber. The world he thought he knew was shifting beneath him, piece by piece. And somewhere far beyond sagebrush, in polished halls lined with maps and signatures, the son who had once buried his father with shame now sat in power, Governor Elias Rhodes, never knowing that the past he tried to bury was rising again in the form of a dusty cowboy with his father's fire in his veins. The discovery hit Jesse like a rifle butt to the chest, knocking loose everything he thought he understood about his blood, his name, his place in the quiet dust of Sagebrush Ridge. After Franklin spoke of the Flint Ridge Accord, Jesse couldn't sleep. His mind gnawed raw by the image of his father, not as the quiet, hard-working man who died in silence, but as a rebel, a resistor, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with a figure now whispered about like a ghost. He found himself digging, asking questions in corners, pressing the oldest ranch hands and drifters for scraps of memory. Most gave nothing but shrugs or spit, but one old Jeb from the livery leaned in over a chipped coffee mug and muttered, "Your pa wore a red sash, same as Rhodes. That's all I'll say." Jesse's hands had trembled when he asked why. Jeb just looked away and said, "Because red meant you'd drawn a line, and that line got men killed." The days grew heavier after that. Franklin, recovering with more lucidity each morning, spoke carefully now, as if weighing what to say and what to spare. "They said we were traitors," he rasped one afternoon, watching a fly buzz against a shaft of light. "But we were trying to stop something that couldn't be undone: land theft, dressed up in law, rail lines drawn through graves, families priced off their futures. Your daddy, he had doubts. Said he didn't want you growing up fatherless. I told him to ride home." Jesse had clenched his jaw, but he never came back. Franklin met his gaze, a look of old regret pooling behind his eyes. He tried to leave. But you don't walk away clean from a fight like that. He died for doing the right thing, and they wrote him out of history like a misprint. That night, Jesse sat alone behind the stable, boots planted in the dirt, fingers tracing the initials carved into his father's old pocket knife. The wind whispered dry through the cottonwoods. He thought of the preacher's warnings, the sheriff's eyes, Morrow's threat. He thought of the lies his mother might have told to protect him, of the silence she kept even as her lungs gave out. And then he thought of the map Franklin had drawn with shaky hands, a rough sketch of the original ranch lines before the state seized the land, before the tracks were laid, before the men in suits claimed progress and crushed the ones who had built it. Jesse stared at the lines, the borders, the place where his father's name was scrawled in the corner, now yellowed and faded. This wasn't just about kindness anymore. It wasn't just mercy for a dying old man. It was inheritance of a fight, of a truth, of a wound left open in the dirt for too long. And yet doubt crept in, cold and sharp. What if Franklin had lied? What if the rebellion was misguided? What if the stories buried by power were buried for a reason? But in Jesse's gut, deeper than words, deeper than blood, a slow certainty began to bloom like fire behind wet timber. If Franklin Rhodes was a liar, then he was the most hunted, broken, and persistent liar Jesse had ever seen. And if he wasn't, if what he said was true, then every man in Sagebrush who turned their head had blood on their hands. Either way, Jesse knew the crossroads had come. The story of his father wasn't over. It had just been silenced. And now, it was Jesse's boots standing in that silence, facing down a past no longer willing to stay buried. They came in on the morning train, stepping down from the last passenger car like shadows carved from coal, 3 men in tailored black suits, polished boots that didn't know mud, eyes that scanned like rifle barrels. No luggage, no introductions, just silence, and a chill that seemed to follow them like a dust cloud. One wore a silver watch on a chain, which he checked often, though the trains in Sagebrush Ridge never ran on time. The townsfolk sensed the shift immediately. Children were called inside. Storefronts closed early. Even Sheriff Dobbs, usually full of spine, gave the men a wide berth as they strolled toward the saloon, their movements too calm for strangers. They asked quiet questions with sharp eyes. Had anyone seen a man named Franklin? Perhaps an old friend, down on his luck. They smiled, handed out coins, gold ones, brighter than anything this town had seen in years. Tulliver, the barkeep, took one with a shaking hand but said nothing. Others weren't so silent. By noon, the riders had been pointed toward the stable. Jesse spotted them from the loft window as he was pouring broth into a tin bowl. Franklin, half asleep on a bed of blankets, didn't need to be told they were the kind of men whose presence you feel before you see. "They found me," he muttered, pushing himself upright with effort. Jesse gritted his teeth, set the bowl down, and stepped outside just as the men reached the stable gate. The lead one, the man with the silver watch, removed his hat and gave Jesse a smile that held no warmth. "Mr. Coltrane," he said, like he already knew the shape of Jesse's life. "We're looking for someone. An old man, sick, delirious, possibly dangerous." Jesse didn't answer. The man continued, drawing a coin from his coat pocket and flipping it in the air. "Bring him to us, and this town stays quiet. You walk away richer, cleaner." Jesse's hand curled around the post beside him, knuckles white. "He ain't yours to take." The man's smile dropped like a mask. "Then he'll be yours to bury." That night, the preacher's house was set ablaze, flames devouring years of sermons and memories, the sky glowing red while no one dared throw water. The preacher survived, barely, coughing in the street, eyes wide with fear and shame. By morning, Tulliver had vanished. No note. No blood. Just an empty saloon and a single gold coin left on the counter. Jesse paced the length of the loft, rifle in hand, breath short, thoughts burning. This wasn't lawmen. This wasn't politics. This was cleansing quiet and cruel. Franklin sat silently near the lantern, watching the flames of a new dawn lick the sky with ash. "They always send men like that," he whispered. "Paid too well to ask questions, dressed too clean to leave answers." Jesse looked down at his boots caked in dirt, worn to the soul. He had no money. No allies. Just a broken old man and a town that would sell its soul to stay quiet. But something inside him had locked into place. He wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was standing between truth and the men who'd spent years erasing it. And now they were coming for him, too. Not with laws, with fire, with silence, with coin. The kind of justice that wears no badge and leaves no graves with names. They left under cover of darkness, slipping through the back of the livery with nothing but a jug of water, a threadbare saddlebag, and the dying wind to hide their tracks. Jesse helped Franklin mount the mare, hoisting him slow and careful as the old man grimaced, bones grinding like rusted gears. The town was silent behind them, a graveyard of shuttered windows and turned backs, the kind of quiet that comes after complicity. They rode east, away from the rail lines and watchful hills, into the cracked desert where only coyotes kept secrets. Franklin swayed in the saddle, breath rattling, eyes half-lidded, and as the stars unfurled overhead like cold silver dust, he reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope creased 100 times, yellowed at the edges. "Meant to send this," he rasped. "Never did." Jesse took it, unfolded it under the flickering lantern light tied to the saddle horn. The ink was shaky but legible. It was addressed to Elias Rhodes. Not Governor Rhodes, just "my son." The letter was raw, full of the kind of ache only a father could bleed. It spoke of conviction, of choices made in fire, of apologies unspoken. "I failed you by telling the truth too late," one line read. Another, "If power asks you to bury your father, let it know I won't rot quiet." Jesse folded the letter slowly, tucking it into his vest, heart thrumming with a quiet reverence. This wasn't just a broken man with ghosts, this was a man who had stood against something monstrous and paid the price. And now Jesse rode beside him, not as a rescuer, but as kin to the same storm. But the desert gives no sanctuary. Just before dawn, as the horizon bruised with the first light, they reached a dried-out arroyo lined with sun-split rocks. That's when the silence broke. A single shot cracked the air. Jesse ducked instinctively, yanking Franklin from the saddle as a second round sparked off stone. 3 men emerged from the ridge, same dark suits, but now coated in dust and grim resolve. Jesse dragged Franklin behind a boulder, heart pounding like hooves. The old man clutched his side, crimson soaking through his shirt. "They tracked us," he coughed. Jesse didn't answer, there was no time. He fired his rifle once, grazing a man's shoulder. The return fire chipped stone, seared air. Jesse felt his lungs burn, his mind sharpen. The next shot came quicker, center mass. One of the riders dropped hard, no sound, just the thud of finality. The others hesitated. Jesse took the moment, aimed again. Another down. The third fled. Jesse didn't chase. He dropped his rifle, chest heaving, fingers numb with shock. The blood on his hands wasn't metaphor anymore, it was thick, real, sticky on his trigger finger. He looked to Franklin, who stared back through pain-drenched eyes. Not with fear, but pride. "You did what needed doing," the old man muttered. Jesse pressed a cloth to the wound, heart hardening like wet clay in Sunday. "We keep moving," he said. The sun rose then, spilling red light across the canyon floor, turning the rocks the color of old wounds. Jesse hoisted Franklin onto the mare again, his own body sore and soul heavier than it had ever been. There was no turning back now, not for them, not for the truth, and not for the men who'd tried to silence both. Behind them, the desert swallowed the blood and the bodies, indifferent. Ahead lay a reckoning still unfinished. The desert gave way to hardpan and brittle grass, as Jesse and Franklin crested the last ridge before Dry Creek Outpost, a lonely speck of a place no larger than a grain shed and a water tower, with a single telegraph line buzzing faintly in the wind like a whisper from civilization. Franklin was half-conscious, slumped in the saddle, blood dried to rust on his shirt, skin pale and clammy. Jesse had tied him in place with a length of rope and kept one hand on his back the whole ride, feeling each shallow breath like a ticking clock. The operator at the station was a boy no older than 16, freckles and wide eyes, clearly uneasy when Jesse stomped in and dropped the worn envelope on the counter. "Send this," Jesse said, voice flat. "Every damn word. Don't ask who. Just do it." The boy hesitated, glancing at the return name scrawled on the letter's face, Franklin Rhodes. Then he nodded, hands trembling as he began tapping out the message into the humming wire. Jesse waited outside under the shade of a dying mesquite, rifle across his knees, eyes on the horizon. He didn't know if the governor would respond, or if he'd send more men in suits to finish what the last ones couldn't. All he knew was that Franklin didn't have long, and this was the last bullet left in the chamber. 3 days passed like years. Jesse camped by the station, barely sleeping, drinking from the rain barrel, checking Franklin's fever with the back of his hand. On the morning of the 4th day, as dust devils danced across the flats, they came. Not riders in black, but a clean wagon drawn by government-bred horses, flanked by 2 cavalry scouts in blue coats. No rifles drawn, no hard eyes. Just a weary-looking physician with a leather satchel and a younger man in a brown duster bearing the governor's seal stitched in gold. Jesse stepped forward as they halted, blocking their path. The younger man, pale, soft-spoken, lifted his hands in peace. "We're here under orders from Governor Rhodes," he said. "For his father." Jesse didn't move at first, just stared, breath shallow. Then he stepped aside and pointed to the stable where Franklin lay on a bed of hay and saddle blankets, barely breathing. The physician rushed past without a word. The young man lingered, looking at Jesse as if trying to solve a riddle no one had given him the clues to. "Are you the one who sent it?" he asked. Jesse didn't reply, just stared through him like he wasn't there. Franklin groaned as they lifted him into the wagon, the doctor checking vitals, whispering low. The old man opened his eyes once, just barely, and saw Jesse standing in the doorway of the stable, hat in hand. He gave a faint nod, too weak to speak. Jesse returned it with the smallest tilt of his chin. Then the door closed, the reins snapped, and the wagon rolled west, toward wherever power kept its family secrets and paid its debts in silence. Jesse watched it go, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. He didn't wave, didn't follow, just stood there while the wind kicked up dust around his boots. The sun was high now, hot and merciless, and the wire still buzzed faintly behind him, carrying echoes of a message that had finally reached its mark. Sagebrush Ridge hadn't changed, not in the way cities did, not in the way men tried to pretend history could be scrubbed clean with time. It still had its crooked signs, its sun-faded shingles, its wooden walkways worn thin by decades of cautious feet. But when Jesse Coltrane rode back into town under the flat gray sky, something was different. The air felt thinner, quieter. Not the silence of fear, like before, but something else. Something that lived between respect and shame. The same folks who once turned their backs now watched from doorways, from behind curtained windows, their eyes lingering a beat longer. Old Jeb from the livery gave a slow nod as Jesse passed. The preacher, scarred from the fire, tipped his hat but said no sermon. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. Tulliver's saloon sat empty, door swinging faintly in the wind, a ghost of piano music rising from memory alone. Jesse said nothing. He didn't explain where he'd been, didn't offer names or reasons. He simply rode through, slow and steady, his saddle creaking with every shift, the weight of all he'd carried pressed into the leather and the lines of his face. Franklin was gone, carried off by men who wore civility like armor, who never spoke of the fire they'd sent first. No reward had followed, no telegram, no mention in any paper. But Jesse hadn't done it for gold or glory. He'd done it because something in his blood wouldn't let him ride the other way. He reached the edge of town and stopped, looking once over his shoulder. The general store's sign hung crooked. A dog barked in the distance. A child waved, timid, from behind her mother's skirts. Jesse raised a hand in return, then lowered it, feeling the moment settle into something permanent inside him. There was no one waiting for him now. No home but the trail. No purpose but the kind a man carves himself from truth, when truth no longer fits in ledgers or laws. He swung into the saddle, the horse shifting beneath him with a snort, dust curling around their boots as the wind kicked up. He didn't know where he'd go next, maybe south, maybe into the hills where names didn't carry the same weight. But wherever it was, he would carry Franklin's story with him, and his father's, and his own. Not in words, but in the set of his jaw, the calluses on his hands, the way he looked a man in the eye without blinking. As he rode out, The sky stretched wide and pale, and the sound of hooves echoed long after the horse had crested the rise. Back in Sagebrush, no one spoke. But one old woman watching from her porch whispered under her breath, a question carried on the wind to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone at once. Would you have done the same? The wind didn't answer. It never did. It only moved onward just like Jesse Coltrane, who disappeared into the horizon beneath a sky too big for any one man to ever outrun.